Very good afternoon to all. Welcome to the book launch and forum today, which is joint organized by the Kuala Lumpur and Selangor Chinese Assembly Hall, Civil Rights Committee, and the Strategy Information and Research Development Center. Before I proceed, I would like to introduce myself. I am Su Wei, the Assistant Secretary of the Civil Rights Committee, Kuala Lumpur and Selangor Chinese Assembly Hall. To kick off the event, please join me in welcoming Mr. Tan Wah Piow, the President of Kuala Lumpur and Selangor Chinese Assembly Hall, to give the speech on his book review.
Wah Piow, distinguished speakers and friends, good afternoon. Now, I think it's an honor that KL Selangor Chinese Assembly Hall can involve in this launching of these two books. Now, I know Dr. Kuan is going to speak after me, so I know he's a prolific writer and speak well, and so I better don't comment on the book. I think that will leave to him mainly. But I would just like to talk about TWP, Tan Wah Piow, as a person. Maybe a big comment on the book. You know, who is this TWP? Not many youngsters around. Relatively, we are slightly more matured. You know, I know about Tan Wah Piow when I was in secondary school days. And the first impression, of course, from a picture in Singju, I think it's still with beard at that time, and the picture only take only the face. So I imagine it's somebody very tall, you know, and especially a public agitator. And so I find very deceiving this man. When I was in UK, I saw him come out in film shows, talk in Leeds. Doesn't look that tall. But of course, he walks tall and he talks as well. Well, very good speaker. But when I say deceiving, even if you look at him now, you know he's a workaholic and he works very hard. And one thing I find from him is he enjoys wine, good food. But don't mistaken, you know, I think what is most valuable in him is a food of thought. So when he entertain you with good food, and if you finish food and that's it, don't talk to him about others' issues and his thinking, then you miss the best part. Yeah, but he also failed me, because when my daughter went to UK, I introduced my daughter to him, thinking that he will politicize her in a way, one way or another. My daughter is also here actually. But end up, you know, he only taught my daughter how to drink wine. And you know, he may actually practicing Democrats, very good hearing skill, listening to people. But as far as wine is concerned, when drinking wine, he do force people or he persuade strongly, I must drink wine. To the extent that if you want to be a progressive, you better drink wine. It's almost like Chairman Mao say, you want to be a revolutionary, you have to take chili, you know. Both these doesn't hold water. So, you know, not everything he says is correct, you know, things like that. Yeah, and up to today, I still don't enjoy wine, you know. So anyway, I think, now, I think in the book, he also mentioned that he may appear to be an extrovert, you know, because he speaks well, think well, but he said he's an introvert at heart. And a proving example is during his hideout, he was watching birds and trying to understand how birds sing and how birds maybe communicate to each other, birds watching. And interesting. But I think he's deceiving also up to today. LKY still don't know how to classify him. Is he a Euro-communist? Or is he a Marxist? Or is he somebody sent by CIA? But yet maybe he's welcomed by the church, and so you don't know who is he and what is he. But that is good for LKY. Guessing game make an old man younger. So maybe that's how LKY still want to stay on. He still need to find out what exactly Wah Piow is thinking. And I think these two books haven't actually touched a lot on those issues. These two books talk about past, talk about Singapore political exile, how they come out from Singapore. And I always feel that after reading through that book, I think it's good material for TV series to see how people come out from Singapore under heavy guard. And I know Wah Piow was boasting, in the book, he said, Johor Strait, it was only 3/4 of a mile wide. So swimming across is no problem, not an impossible feat, but BUT. And he, of course, he didn't swim across. I don't believe he can swim across. the China, the World Bank, I think working World Bank, the Lin Yifu, that man really swim from Taiwan to Xiamen to go to China. But I cannot imagine Wah Piow doing that. So, but if he take less wine and less good food, maybe he can one day. And I strongly advise him there because I think if Wah Piow want to walk tall in Singapore, he have to live longer than LKY. And I think that is important. Now, of course, the second book precisely describes about the Marxist conspiracy and things like that. That is where I think I find quite a number of interesting ideas in there. And he talked about his politics and about the democratic socialist alternative. Talk about an alternative to ISA, and he even mentioned about maybe it should be handled by normal criminal law procedure. That's his line. Talk about economic agenda. Talk about the options within the capital framework. Now all this, I think, is what the youngsters want to know. It's no point talking now, appealing just to us here. I think the youngsters in Singapore want to know post-LKY, what is the relevance of DWP to them? It's not just how he escaped from Singapore, whether he swim or run or hide in a box or what. Those are important to know. But to be relevant today for DWP is how Singapore should move on from now. What alternative? What is going to be different? And that actually have big implication to Malaysian. Malaysian equally want to know now, and if there's a future new government, what is different? Other than corruption, and what is different in their foreign policy? What should be the new, I shouldn't say new economic policy, alternative economic policy, and things like that. Those are important to the youngsters. And I think it is definitely important. Of course, when I think LKY worried about Wah Piow is, Wah Piow move around, talk well. And one thing, Wah Piow is something that is really inspiring to me because although he's a thinker about important things, he knows how to live his life, and he can mix with all walks of life. You can mix with him if you don't talk about politics, and he can just talk to you about food, about everything. And I think that is a beautiful thing. Many of younger people have to learn that. There's no need to talk about politics every moment. You want to eat, also eat politically, sleep, also sleep politically. It doesn't work like that. Younger people like to learn from you, but as a person, he must feel close to you. So our DWP in UK can gather a lot of new information, new idea about policy, economic, social. Of course, there are ideas that are very out of the box. For example, he actually mentioned a book. He said USA, listen, the USA could evolve to become the first socialist country in the world, structured on a democratic framework based on the rule of law. And that need to be, we really need to find out from him what exactly he's talking about. His ideas seems to run very wild. But maybe he have good ideas. But so, I think I feel important is, we all have hope and expectation from DWP. Our expectation is, we like to be inspired more by him, by his thinking, DWP thinking. Not DWP thought, because people thought it's a communist way of saying, Mao Zedong thought, so DWP thought, that is not up to that level. But his thinking is important to let us know more about what he expects Singapore to be if there is a new government in Singapore. I think it's possible, isn't it? Always possible. But the youngsters in Singapore need to know that. So, as we said in Mandarin, 我们要走出悲情，我们要走出过去。We have to walk out from the past, facing the future. But I think up to today, DWP have I mean, he do leave behind legacy as well. In Mandarin again, somebody said, you want to lead your life in a way that 人不在江湖，江湖还传说你的故事。人不在新加坡，新加坡还在传说他的故事。When you are no more in Singapore, but that community, that society should talk about you and your legacy, not because just legacy, because what they expect from you, and there's high expectation from both Singaporean and Malaysian on him. Now, I told Kwa that I thought of singing a song to end up, first time in my speech. But I thought so many people I don't know, it will be a bit embarrassing. And knowing that Kwa Yew Song is a good singer. But no, this... but this is just dedicated to Wah Piow lah. No, well, when I see him, I remember my days in UK, all those good songs we sing. So there's one song I think is interesting, Dickendanken Sinfrei. I can't pronounce very well a German song, but Kwak Yew Song said, never mind, nobody understand what you sing. But I can only sing in English. Dickendanken Sinfrei, my thoughts give me power. Die Gedanken sind frei, my thoughts freely flower. No hunter can trap them, no dungeon can trash them, no man can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei, no man can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei. Thank you.
Thank you to our President, Mr. Tan, for his speech and the song. Next, I would like to invite Dr. Kwa to say a few words.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here today. And it's a great change from the usual, whenever there's a Singapore event, it's almost a memorial, somebody has passed away. So today I'm very pleased, I'm very honored to be celebrating two books. Whenever any alternative history is published in Malaysia and Singapore, it's a cause for celebration. And it's an occasion for intellectuals. You know, sometimes people like Kuan Yew, they come across articulate dissidents like Wah Piow and Leng and people like that. I think they think you are just, you know, bloody nuisance. It's interesting reading about a Marxist conspiracy, you know, in Wah Piow's book and in Leng and the other books. Because only at 11 o'clock this morning, while I was having my chrysanthemum tea break, not so much a wine break like Wah Piow has, I was having my tea break at 11 o'clock, and the BBC World Service was starting a new series called The Masters of Money. There's supposed to be three masters of economic thinking of the 20th century. One of them is Maynard Keynes. One of them is Hayek. And the third person, you know, that Kuan Yew and the other special branch in Singapore don't seem to understand, and in Malaysia, Karl Marx. So these are the three giants of economic thinking that the BBC World Service is just starting this morning. That the crisis of capitalism today in the world is starting a rethinking, is starting capital reading groups all over again, you know, from the time when I was in Britain in the 70s. Today they're starting all over again. People are rethinking because you have to. You remember the way in which the autocrats in Malaysia and Singapore think. When the Berlin Wall collapsed, they talked about socialism as if it was something of the past. And recently, what has happened in America and the West, you know, when the auto industry in the United States has had to be nationalized, when the banks in the UK has to be nationalized, you just think back to the early 90s, when they were thinking about, nationalization. And that's why I say issues of that kind, it's important that Malaysians and Singaporeans rethink. And these two books as well, it's interesting to read about the drama, the escapades, But I hope that these writers have not exposed all the escape routes so that when some of us want to make our escape, it's not just a 3/4 mile that we have to swim across, that there are other creative routes that have not been exposed by these writers. And humor, of course, we must always have humor. It's good to read about humor because you can't take these people seriously. I remember the ironies and the humor in these books is quite interesting. I remember reading Solang's book about the Blue Gate, how on the night before she was arrested, she was watching a Miss Universe contest on TV. And I remember when Dr. Nasser was arrested, they came in the middle of the night and he was living in the countryside. And the special branch had come to do a recce early in the night. And the tires got stuck in some mud or some hole. And Nasser came out to help them push the car out. I mean, I think that is a remarkable, irony. And then, of course, they came back in the night to thank him and took him away. In the newspapers, to the mainstream newspapers in Malaysia today, we read about how Singapore is trying to reinvent itself. It's trying to have its cyber troopers. The UMNO in Malaysia have got their cyber troopers. The PAP have suddenly decided after the last debacle in the last general elections, their cyber troopers need to come out. But it seems they're not doing very well. This is, I think, the new media, the internet, is such a fantastic leveler. We are not anymore beholden to the Straits Times and the New Straits Times and the Star and all these mainstream media. This battle of ideas, we used to say in the 70s, this battle of ideas can be fought in the new media, and let's see how good they are. So when we have two books of this kind being published, and every new book that is published, it is testing time for the autocrats, for the reactionaries, because they always, I don't know, since university days, I find that reactionary ideas in the universities especially always fail miserably, So I welcome this new battle of ideas, especially the new activist intellectuals. As they say, the philosophers always say, cogito ergo sum. I know, therefore I exist. But there's another, the activist intellectual says, I resist, therefore I exist. I think that's a better reframing of that situation. And reading the books again, I suppose revisiting the issues of the past as exposed in Wah Piow and Solong and Leng's books. I find that the judiciary in Singapore is certainly reminiscent of a banana republic. It's really quite amazing. We know how bad the Malaysian judiciary is, how Mahathir assaulted the judiciary in 1988, etc. And I went through the farce, the hocus pocus of habeas corpus applications. But reading Wah Piaw's book and the way in which the judge, and Wah Piow had asked him, are you not interested in justice? And the judge replies and saying, as far as you are concerned, no. I think such a judge should really be impeached. I don't think I've ever seen this in Malay. I know Thomas is sitting there. I don't know whether he has seen such a thing. I've never seen such a thing in Malay. It's never gone that bad, So Singapore may have all these trimmings of advanced, it's the richest country in the world today in terms of per capita income. When it was a poor, struggling country, when it just separated from Malaysia, they were justifying the ISA, saying because we're so poor, we're struggling to survive in this world, we need the ISA. And now, they're the richest country in the world. And they've gone back on their words. They've gone back on their words when they said that when Malaysia access the ISA, they will axe the ISA as well. You see, they've gone back on their words. So if you go back on your words, you can always pull this out of your pockets. All this Marxist conspiracy also reminds me of the far right in Malaysia. So you can compare the PAP to the far right in Malaysia. I've been surfing the web, and the things they've been saying about people like us, how we're like the Min Yuan. They said the Min Yuan, like the emergence. Some of these kind of terms they use: Marxist conspiracy, Euro-communist, etc. These are terms that are very, today if you look at the blogs, the internet, very reminiscent of the far right in Malaysia. So this is what they have in common. And it reminds me of that famous line in Victor Jara's famous poem, one of his last poems before he was killed in 1973, Estadio Chile, in the stadium. And he was talking about the fascist regime that was about to kill him that day. And he says, they go about their work with the precision of a knife. Nothing seems to stop them. So the way they carry out all these operations, Spectrum, Lalang, whatever it is, the lengths they go to frame you, to fix you, to frustrate you in the courts, etc. They go about it through with the precision of a knife. And I have a kind of sympathy with Singaporeans because I myself was at NUS in 1978-79, and I was fixed as well. I was asked to leave the university at very short notice, 24-hour notice. And at the time, it's too petty to, they frame you on a very petty charge, And when I was at NUS, I can only remember one professor, Enright, who wrote the Confessions, what's it called? Confessions of a Mendicant Professor, But you realize that there were, before me and between Professor Enright and people like me, there was a long list of professors and lecturers and assistant lecturers, etc., who were asked to leave Singapore, unbeknown to most people, So you'd be surprised when that list is compiled, how many people have been asked to leave and framed on very, very petty charges. Because I was teaching sociology, and the Goh Keng Swee education report had just come out, How do you expect a sociology not to comment about a very elitist education report, And I was teaching sociology about what I thought in Singapore at the time was a very frivolous, not very intellectual theory about modernization, Singaporeans are achievement-oriented, therefore they modernize, whereas the poor countries in Africa are not achievement-oriented, so they don't modernize, that kind of stuff. Where I found Marxist theories and other development theories much more interesting. And so this is again, when we're talking about the battle of ideas, let it commence in the new media. And there's also, besides the pettiness, the vindictiveness. Only last year, the Lim Lian Giok gave a Lim Lian Giok award to Chia Tai Po, And if you see somebody like Chia Tai Po, who couldn't hurt a fly, being detained for 32 years, that has to be a very vindictive regime, a very vindictive person who could do such a thing. And is Singapore still insecure after all these years? Are they still not going to give back TWP, his citizenship, and the other people who are exiles in the West? These are questions, and I like the mood that Tan Yu Sing has set. I hope that from now on, any horror on Singapore will be upbeat, and we'll be talking about things to come. We'll be moving on. Memorials would be causes for celebration of the lives of people who have gone. And we look forward to the challenge, of the future intellectuals, the future youth in Singapore, of what they can, how we can take on the PAP, And I think we've got a fairly active civil society in Malaysia, and it would be good if you can have a very active civil society in Singapore as well. I haven't served the Singapore web except for the few Think Center and all that. But I would like to see a much more active civil society. And like the civil societies in ASEAN, in Malaysia, Singapore, and the ASEAN countries to have greater interaction. because there are issues that are very close to my heart and to the civil society in this country. For example, defense policy. Singapore is leading the group, the ASEAN group, in terms of defense spending, and that is a very bad, there's a very bad trend for the rest of ASEAN. It is giving regimes like Malaysia an excuse to spend unnecessarily on arms. You know, Singapore spends about 4 to 5% on arms per year. And that is one area in which we can work together for a civil society to work together to cut down and work together on a culture of peace in ASEAN. The ASEAN Human Rights Charter, in a debilitated form, has come into being. And that is another area in which civil societies in Singapore and Malaysia can work together to have a ASEAN Human Rights Court, a much more up to par human rights charter, and then to have a human rights court. So that when we have cases of TWP being stripped of its citizenship, we can appeal to a ASEAN Human Rights Court as you have in Europe. Okay? I would look forward also to the time when we were part of Malaya. And I think there are some issues in terms of culture as well. Recently I saw a very good play written by Alfian. I think Alfian helped So Long with a text, a manuscript. That was played in Malaysia, a very good play. And in terms of culture and the arts, these are areas in which Malaysians and Singaporeans can interact. And so let us rejuvenate, this word used in Wah Piaw's book, let us rejuvenate our two societies. Let us recall the days of Malaya, because I still have many friends and relatives in Singapore, because I come from Johor, same place as Saudara Said Hussein, in which Singapore used to be a closer metropolis than Kuala Lumpur. You know, before the highways were built, Kuala Lumpur was a very long way to go, and we didn't feel like coming to Kuala Lumpur because of the long road. So there's no reason why we cannot rejuvenate the old, let's bring back together the old Malayan connections, because I think more connections than we have with Sabah and Sarawak. So there's no reason why the civil societies in these two countries and the rest of ASEAN can work together on that front. And as Yu Sing said, let us inspire the youth. Inspire the youth with democracy, with human rights, with culture, with arts, with the battle of ideas, intellectual stimulation, etc. And we can see there's a new spring in the gate of Singaporeans today. After the last general election, I can sense a new Singapore spring. And I think issues like reclaiming the citizenship of Wah Piow and other exiles in UK can be a new, I don't see why it cannot be a new issue. Starting an issue to reclaim the citizenship of Lim Leong Geok, who lost it in 1961. Why can't we fight for the citizenship, reclaim the citizenship of Wah Piow and the others, in Singapore? That will, these books, I think, will be a good start to such a campaign. And even when Myanmar is moving ahead, and Malaysia has ditched its ISA, there's no reason why Singapore should not be challenged to do the same with the ISA in Singapore. And again, for all our exiles, I think the best solutions to many solutions that we face today in the world is to reframe what exiles, to be an exile is like. I think when we reframe that, the fact that you can come to Malaya, you can come to Malaysia, you can come to Johor Bahru to meet your loved ones, I think that is quite a good reframe. Compared to me who can't go to Sarawak, which is many times bigger than Singapore. Many Malaysians can't go to Sarawak anymore. That's again a reframe, make you feel better. Wah Piow, do you feel better now? And the biggest reframe, I think, today, what is happening in Gaza, is to think of the Palestinian people as exiles in their own homeland. An entire Palestinian people are exiles in their own homeland. And that is the biggest reframe, I think, to our problems we have today. And I'm sure Francis Koo, rest in peace, and Sui Chai will agree with this reframe. And so once again, I'm very honored and very pleased to be able to launch these two books. And I think Wah Piow, if Yu-Sing is right, should have brought a bottle of champagne and we could have crashed a bottle of champagne to launch the book. Otherwise, launching the book is just by saying it, we launched the books. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kwa, for that, for the sharing. Now, I would like to invite all the speaker, moderator, and VIP to be on stage for the launch. 1, 2, 3. Thanks. Moderator.
Good afternoon, and I must say that I'm really honored to be among the three very distinguished speakers here. And two of them are really old friends of mine. Just to introduce them, and then I will do a longer introduction of all of them. On my right-hand side is, of course, the TWP, Tan Wah Piow. I have to stand up. Okay. Okay, let me... on my now left-hand side is Tan Wah Piow, who is a former student leader who fell on the wrong side of politics in Singapore. Don't know now is left or right side. He was jailed in 1975, and in 1976 he went into exile in UK. And he now practices law. And in 1987, Singapore accused him of being a Marxist mastermind, an allegation he refused in his book called Smokescreens and Mirrors. And Wah Piow actually calls a campaign to restart, rejuvenate, and reclaim the Constitution. And the next speaker is actually Dr. G Rahman, who is a commercial lawyer and a leading authority on probate, wills, and trusts in Singapore with about 40 years in practice. And in 1969 and 74, he made his sympathies clear by acting as a legal advisor to the University of Singapore Students' Union and student activists. And he was involved as a defense lawyer when Tan Wah Piow and two other workers were persecuted on the trumped-up charges of rioting. Dr. Rahman was detained under ISA in February 1977 for more than 1 year. And Dr. Rahman authored the book on probate and administrative law and practices for Singapore and Malaysia. And the last speaker is actually Dr. Wong Chin Huat, a well-known activist in the Malaysian civil society movement, political scientist by training, and he serves as a Bersih committee member. He also campaigns for electoral reform and civil and political rights. His PhD from the University of Asean is in fact on electoral party system and also party politics in West Malaysia. And he writes political commentaries for the Nutgraph, Singapore, Selangor Times, and Malaysia Kini, amongst others. He's currently attached to the Penang Institute, a think tank linked to the state government. And with that, I'd like to first of all invite Dr. Wong Chin Huat to actually speak for 15 minutes. It's up to you where you want to be. They may want to see you.
Yeah, I'm not tall enough, so it's best that I come here. Good afternoon, everyone. I have been a guest at Wah Piow's home, and today is a great honor for me to be here. When he was arrested, I was only 2 years old. I just came back from this green walk, which is part of, we just took part for 10 kilometers this morning. The entire walk was 300 kilometers, but that was nothing compared to, the distance, the width of Johor Straits. And certainly nothing compared from, whatever way that you get from Singapore to UK. So it's a great honor for me to share my thought. What struck me a lot was actually what among other things, what Kiasun Kwa said just now, the comment by Judge Sina Toure, I think bad guy's name should be remembered, when he said that I'm not interested in justice as far as you are concerned. And Wah Piow was sentenced for a year and jail for 8 months. And on the surface, he was convicted for rioting. But what actually his crime? I believe that this probably would be a better description in his words to his university friends after his release. He said that I was conditioned to have my eyes blinded so that I see no social evils, my ears plugged so that I hear no cries of the people, and in case I did see or hear some evil, my mouth was to be gagged so that I spoke no protest. I broke the rule altogether. I ripped the blindfold and saw the pathetic living conditions of neglected pioneers of Chinatown and the exploited workers of Jurong. I dug out the earplugs and heard the voice of Said Sahari coming from behind the prison walls. Finally, I took the decisive step to deliberate myself. I spoke up. And speaking up was his crime. Now, you ask what kind of state that you would actually be, you get in prison for speaking up. I think Thomas Paine's famous quotation can help us to put things in context. He said that government, even at its best, is but a necessary evil, and at its worst, an intolerable one. I think eventually that's the case. How do you look at all these things? If you look at both Malaysia and Singapore, you will always have people who say the state have to do all these things because it's necessary. But I think for the victims, it's intolerable. And deep down is the evil that would have to cripple your ability to think, to hear what your heart has to say. And if you look at both Singapore and Malaysia, the necessity of authoritarianism, of all this high-handedness, violations of human rights, are basically justified in two ways. One is to prevent the triumph of communism, which was what was actually thrown at Wah Piow later on. And the other one is to prevent ethno-religious conflict. Because apparently that we are multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural, multilingual, and therefore we are prone to get into riot, and therefore you need a strong government to reign on us, to make sure that we can live long and peacefully. Now, I would call both Malaysia and Singapore an electoral one-party state. In other words, one-party state with elections. To put it simply, we are like the People's Republic of China, except that they are more honest. They don't believe in democracy, and they call themselves, they write it into their constitutions. We, on the other hand, we pretend that we are democracy because we have regularly held elections, but real opposition would always be suppressed, elections are rigged, and so on. And your civil service and your state institution would treat the ruling party as if the synonym of the state. And there's no, if you look back at the historical origins of these two countries, there was actually an outcome of a few attempts to create two-party system in Malaysia. From 1964 to 1965, when PAP tried to, first of all, put itself as a substitute to MCA, as the Chinese partner for UMNO, and then later on tried to build a coalition, which was called Malaysian Solidarity Convention, MSC, to challenge the alliance that Tengku or his party colleagues decided and say the best way is actually to expel Singapore, and a failed two-party system ending up producing two very successful electoral one-party states. It's a simple mathematical formula, and that's what we are in. And we look back from what I say, that how these two countries, the two one-party states, have successfully justified their existence, is basically based on fear. Fear that the country may be overwhelmed by communism, and that's in the context of Cold War. And secondly, that we would end up in a fire of communal riots. And both countries, you can always look back to some history and say, well, the danger is clear and pleasant. And if you look back and what it is now today, I don't know Singapore enough to offer my view on post LKY Singapore. But I think there's something maybe we can look at in Malaysia. For the Malaysian state, especially the Malaysian police, communism is still as if it's alive, even though that the peace accord has been signed with the Malayan Communist Party in 1989. So every now and then you heard the state talking about that the communist conspiracy here and there and so on. Among other things, Brazil was also implicated at some point. Red is always a dangerous color. Now, but increasingly it doesn't hold water anymore. It doesn't hold water. If, among other things you look at, first of all, after 1990, the Cold War has ended and so on, but also that the end of Cold War, ironically, has done away the state, the non-communist states, concerned about inequality. The state has become much more, no longer worrying that there would be a communist insurgencies. They ignore the increasing inequality, which in turn undermines their legitimacy. Today, you look at all the changes in Malaysia. An underlying reason is because that the increasing intra-ethnic inequalities amongst the Malays, which is undermining the legitimacy of UMNO rule, because that UMNO can no longer claim to say they represent all the Malays, and they're defending the legitimate interests of the Bumiputra, because you have poor Bumiputra working at, for example, 7-Eleven. All you need to do is walk into 7-Eleven at midnight, and you find that those people manning the counters are none other than the Bumiputras. They're making maybe 800 to 1,000 SPM leavers. And I always wonder whether they can keep their job 10 years down the road, because there will be cheaper people to replace them. Not necessarily foreign workers, they could be, younger Bumiputra and so on. So there's always a concern that how the legitimacy, the basis of their rule has been challenged. Now, the second thing about the situation in Malaysia, of course, is that the improvement in ethno-religious situations. In the aftermath of the political tsunami, many people complain and say that the communal relations in Malaysia has worsened because you have seen endless episodes of ethno-religious tensions, including political violence. To name a few, you have the cowhead protests in 2009. In 2010, you have the fire of Allah, when the word Allah was allowed to be used by the non-Muslim, which triggered a series of vandalisms and arsons of churches and mosques and so on. Now, but what you really have to look at was actually the other way around. That today, these were actually a sideline compared to the bigger picture. Malaysians are actually much more braver to embrace each other. And one of the reasons is really there was a field promise by the current regime. None other than the field promise of ethnic riots after 2008. Because we have been taught all this while that if you change the government, then you should be prepared. You should be prepared for the replay of May 13. So after March 8, 2008, that's what should have happened. But janji tidak ditepati. You didn't see riots happening in Selangor, in Penang. You did not see curfew. And people get bolder. It took 3 years, nevertheless, for Malaysians to really stood up and defy the threat from the state. July 9 last year, despite the state arrest of 200 people in a year before that, among others, our friends, six of our friends from PSM, they were arrested. They were detained for more than a month. Despite the threat of ethnic riots by Perkasa and other right-wing groups, knowing well that you would meet with tear gas, water cannon, police baton, and so on. 50,000 Malaysians marched into the center, into the heart of Kuala Lumpur. On that day, I consider a new Malaysia was born. Because the old Malaysia, in the Malaysia 1.0 before that day, we believe that we are ultimately each other's threat, enemy, because we are different. On that day, Malaysians realize and say, no, that's not true. Whatever your color, your skin color, whatever your faith, when you are hit by tear gas and water cannon, you are just human bodies. And you know well that the next person, the person next to you, regardless of the background, is not your enemy. They will be the one who pull you out and run together. And you have very touching stories happening on that day, among others that I think near Tongshin Hospital, there were Malay protesters who asked their Chinese counterpart to run away. There were two explanations to that. The last interesting explanation was that you guys were newbies. You don't come to protest so often, so you don't know how to deal with the police. We are veterans, so we deal with it. So you run first, we take care of the police. The more dramatic explanation was this, that if there must be bloodshed, let it be the Malay blood, because we cannot afford the May 13. Now that crushed the specter of May 13 forever. The funeral was held on that day. There's no way it could come back. And what you see from then, after Brazil 2, there have been, I think at least I've counted last time, is at least about 20 protests nationwide for all kinds of causes, with the number of participants ranging from a few hundreds to what we claim for Brazil 3, 250,000, took place in a time frame about 1.5 years. That's a new Malaysia that we never know about. The justification for authoritarianism in Malaysia was crushed because of the accident of March 8, 2008, which was not entirely accidental, of course. You look back, the root cause of that was paved in the success of NDP, which led to the first and the second Sikhisms in UMNO in the late 80s and the late 90s, which eventually brought to the political tsunami. Now, about what would be in store for Singapore, just about 2 months ago, I had a chance to meet with an ex-MP from Singapore, of course from PAP, in an academic forum in China. And I put a point-blank question to him. I say, sir, how long do you think PAP would continue to rule Singapore? It was a forum on one-party state. And the gentleman was very frank. He said that, I believe we can survive the next election. I can't say more than that for the next one and the next one. It depends on how good we, PAP, can respond to the needs of the society, and also how good our competitor, by that he referred to only worker parties, in capturing the imaginations of the people. So PAP was very sober, at least for this guy. He was very sober, this politician was very sober, that change was perhaps inevitable. It's just a matter of time. It's not a question of if, but a question of when. Now, just last week, I had the pleasure to share a forum with a Malaysian politician, young politician, Mr. Liu Chintong, who has spent his time in Singapore and visited Singapore rather frequently. And he said that in that forum that he thinks PAP may not last the next election. And his reason is that, I mentioned earlier, after the end of Cold War, the developing countries have been ignoring the increasing gap of wealth in its population, Singapore included. So in the last election, you find that for Singapore, for the Singapore model to succeed, the country has spent a lot of time in, but the country has spent a lot of effort in bringing in foreign immigrants, which has caused the local populations to revolt against it. If you were there in Singapore during their last campaign, you find many Singaporean flags in the opposition campaign rallies. So Singaporean flag is no longer a prerogative of PAP. It's one that opposition would take up and raise and say that we are here because we are Singaporean, therefore we want a new, we want a new political configuration. So my friend Chin Tung think that they may not be able to last next election. And of course, how would that bring to all of us is something that perhaps we can learn from Wah Piow and Mr. Gap. Thank you.
Thank you, Chin Huan. I will now call on to our next speaker, Dr. G Rahman, to share with us for 20 minutes.
Yeah, I'll try to finish it within 15 minutes because I'm sure there are lots of people out there who would like to raise issues with us, the members of the panel. Now, I come from Singapore, a political desert. I say it's a political desert. As I go along, I'll amplify on this point I'm trying to make. Fortunately for us, since May last year, after the last elections, although it is a political desert, there has been a gentle drizzle falling on Singapore. Why? For the first time in Singapore's political history, after a lot of gerrymandering has been done, with drawing boundaries, delineating constituency as to how many constituencies there will be in one group representation constituency, 2 to 6, it varied, making the task difficult for opposition parties. For the first time in Singapore's political history since 1984, you had one GRC returning an opposition party comprising 5 members, and those were the members of the Workers' Party. In addition, they also succeeded in capturing a constituency known as Hougang. So they have 6 members of the opposition who now sit in parliament. But that does not mean, as they say, one swallow doesn't make a spring or summer, whatever. The fact that there are 6 members of the opposition in an 82-member parliament does not mean that the opposition has arrived. There's a lot of hard work. There's a lot of battle going on even now on cyberspace between the PAP and the opposition parties, as well as civil groups, civil society groups in Singapore. Unfortunately, we don't have that kind of extensive civil group activity that you are fortunate to have in Malaysia. Like Dr. Wong Chin Huat, he is active. So is Mr. Dr. Kwa, and so many of you others. We have been suppressed for many years, since 1959. 59 to 1961, we had a bit of liberalism. Lee Kuan Yew wanted to have intellectual exchanges, tussle with anybody who stood up against him. But after 61, no. He didn't want to waste time disagreeing or debating with the opposition parties. And if I may refer back to what Dr. Kwa quoted on the book by Professor D.J. Enright, who was a professor of English in the University of Singapore, as it was then called. What he said was, the book is called Memoirs of a Mendicant Professor. The word mendicant means beggar. So he referred to that learned professor as a beggar. Why? And this was coined by the late S. Rajaratnam, who was Minister for Culture. Terribly uncultured term to use, if you ask me, referring to a professor of the English literature as a mendicant. Why insult him in that fashion? What the sin that D.J. Enright committed was to say that you can't artificially create a culture. Singapore was trying to create what it labeled as a Singaporean culture, a meld or a blend of Chinese, Indian, Western, Malay cultures together. this has to brew very gradually. Then you evolve, you create a blend comprising all these different strands. It's then a matter of long process, long time before it can really be called a Singaporean culture with an identity which is Singaporean. So, if professors of English literature can be labeled and scolded and abused, what more with activists like Tan Wah Piow? Prefer false charges, charge him in court, put him in prison. That's a style. And if I may go back to Professor Enright, one sentence in his book is still outstanding, very strongly registered in my own mind. He said Singapore is a one-party state, the PAP. And the PAP is a one-man party. Who's the one man? You all know who he is. He's still around, kicking around. He's not dead yet. So I can't really say prelude to the post-Lee Kuan Yew era. It's not post yet. The man is still around. You know, if he were dead, I would be quoting Mark Antony. I'll be saying from this stage, I come here to bury Lee Kuan Yew, not to praise him. But alas, he's still alive. So it's not yet time for me to utter those memorable words of Shakespeare. Now, he is still a member of parliament, Lee Kuan Yew. And his son, as you know, is the Prime Minister of Singapore. He occupies an office that he used to occupy at the Istana. The Istana there is the place where the President goes, the Prime Minister goes, the Senior Minister, one Mr. Goh Chok Tong goes, and Lee Kuan Yew, now an ordinary MP, but he has got all the panoply of power that he had when he held office. He has Gurkha guards posted outside his house, bodyguards escorting him whenever he goes out, receives visiting foreign dignitaries at the Istana, which is not his residence, and of his staff, he has a large group of civil servants who attend to his every need. And mind you, when he stepped down as Prime Minister and Goh Chok Tong took over as Senior Minister, the very next day he called a meeting of all the permanent secretaries of the different ministries. So what's the big talk about he giving up office? He never did. So he carried on controlling the cabinet. And this, if I may refer to what Goh Chok Tong himself said about the role of Lee Kuan Yew in the new cabinet, of which he's the Prime Minister. And this quote is taken from a book by a man called Raj Vasil. And the title of the book is Governing Singapore. And the dialogue he had with Goh Chok Tong is quoted as an appendix to that book. And Goh Chok Tong was asked by Raj Vasil, what is the role of the Senior Minister? Lee Kuan Yew was then called Senior Minister. What is the role of the Senior Minister in the cabinet? And his answer was, Goh Chok Tong, and he was quite frank, I believe, he said, we, the new cabinet comprising young ministers, every Wednesday we meet up over lunch. And then we brainstorm each other. We hold a meeting, we brainstorm each other. After that, we call the Senior Minister in. The Senior Minister will then take over the chair. That means he chairs that meeting. Chairs a meeting of ministers who are supposed to comprise the cabinet. He's no more in the cabinet. I mean, maybe in the cabinet, but as in an advisory capacity. He then takes over the chair and he gives us his own views. So at that time, he had not given up his grip on power. And I don't know what made Goh Chok Tong accept the position of Senior Minister, because on the eve of his Goh Chok Tong as Prime Minister, because on the eve of his appointment as Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew abused him. How? You know, he called him, first of all, he said, Goh Chok Tong is not my first choice as Prime Minister. He had 3 names mentioned. Tony Tan, who is now currently President of Singapore, Ong Teng Cheong, the late Ong Teng Cheong, who was President of Singapore. Before that, he was NTU Secretary General. And the third person was S. Dhanabalan, And then he says, Dhanabalan can't be a prime minister of a country which is predominantly Chinese. Ong Teng Cheong is all right in Chinese, but he's not terribly eloquent in English, which is a falsehood. He was eloquent in both languages. Tony Tan cannot because he may want to go back to his banking life. So the fourth choice, this is to quote Lee Kuan Yew's order of priority, fourth choice was Goh Chok Tong. And he also has an impediment in his speech. He speaks as if he has got false dentures, you know. I'm not sure whether he has got false dentures. This is Lee Kuan Yew. And he needs psychiatric help for him to articulate the syllables properly. Can anybody who has been so insulted on the eve of his appointment accept that post? But he did it. And he did it for one simple reason, as I fathom it now, you know, what went on in Lee Kuan Yew's mind. Because he had his son waiting in the wings, as it were, Lee Hsien Loong was going to take over. He reminded me of Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was a man who was short in stature. Kate, as the Malays would say, you know. Whenever he went around reviewing troops, he took with him another general who was shorter than him. So you see, his height and his presence is bigger than that of the shorter general. Unfortunately for Goh Chok Tong, he was an articulate man. He couldn't pronounce words properly. Some syllables were swallowed, some syllables somehow tumbled out of his mouth. Lee Hsien Loong, eloquent man, good in 4 languages: English, Mandarin, Malay, and I think he knew Russian as well, although I've never heard him speaking. He has studied it, and he even went to the extent of trying to write in Jawi, you know. Brilliant guy, but there are other aspects of his character which may not conduce to he being a leader. But today he runs Singapore. So Goh Chok Tong took over as a last choice that Lee Kuan Yew had. But understand the workings of that man's diabolical mind. He was targeting Lee Hsien Loong to be the prime minister. So get in somebody in the interim who is not as good as the eventual choice will be. So that's Lee Kuan Yew's style. If you understand him, if you know his character, then you'll know why Singapore is a political desert. But fortunately, the last elections have proved that things are never static. There is an evolution in any society. If you remember the Shah of Persia, he gave everything to the people in Persia, but he was overthrown. If you remember Muammar Gaddafi, why he was thrown out? He gave everything. There was no income tax payer. Petrol was very cheap. But people have to go because the mood, the stage in which societies are evolving is different. So you can't have everything static for an indefinite time. As I said, Lee Kuan Yew still holds power in an indirect, oblique way. He has not given it up. So it is not yet time to sing a requiem to Lee Kuan Yew. Let me just run through very quickly a little bit about Singapore's past. Lee Kuan Yew became Prime Minister in June 1959. After the elections, his party, the PAP, won 43 out of 51 seats. And he won so many because he had the support of the left. And all his cadres and activists were left-leaning at that time. He had the great support of people like Lim Chin Siong, Fong Swee Suan, Jamit Singh, James Puducherry. These are all icons of the left in Singapore. Now, I remember after the elections, Lee Kuan Yew spoke at the Padang. Padang is that large field in front of City Hall. And he said, "Your joys are my joys. Your tears are my tears." Today, the refrain is different. His joys are Singaporeans' tears. Singaporeans' tears are his joy. That's what it has come to. But as I said, from May 2011 the gentle showers have begun to fall on Singapore. You have people sitting up. Thanks to cyberspace and the internet, there is so much of activity going on there that all the humbug, all the untruths the Straits Times and the Today newspaper put across is being counteracted, is being rebutted. So there is no more fables that these newspapers can put across which Singaporeans have to swallow. No. There is the alternative view. And these two books also present the truth, what really happened, and why poor Tan Wah Piow was persecuted. But he stood firm. And today he is before us, telling us his version of what really happened. Now let me go back a little bit in history on the formation of Malaysia. And Singapore was supposed to be a component of that federation. Malaysia was born on 16 September 1963. Before it took shape, there was severe antagonism from the left-wing and the progressive-minded people. Even people who you can classify as middle of the road or right-wing. In Singapore, the East Malaysian territories, in fact, opposed the idea of the federation because the terms that were offered were not acceptable to them. It was one-sided, and the center in Malaysia, the federal government, had greater say to the disadvantage of the East Malaysian states. Singapore, through Lee Kuan Yew, was terribly disadvantaged. In fact, the terms on which Singapore was to merge with mainland Malaya was not made very clear. And the Barisan Socialists, which was the opposition party, the leading opposition party, advocated that blank votes be cast. Blank votes, each blank vote would be a protest against the proposed federation of Malaysia. But you know what Lee Kuan Yew did? He convened parliament and he said, if there are blank votes being cast, it is up to Parliament, or at that time Legislative Assembly, up to the Legislative Assembly to decide what the blank votes will represent. There were three choices. Sorry, I'm not here to tell long stories. I'll be very brief. So, that is classic political chicanery, cheating. The three are terms. The first one was Singapore shall merge on the same terms as the other states of West Malaysia. Then you had, I can't recall exactly, you had terms similar to what was offered to Sabah and Sarawak. And the third one, was to merge according to what the PAP put across. And I think Singapore wanted autonomy in education and labor. So it was totally confusing. The voters did not know what to do. So a large number of them turned up and cast blank votes. And of course, you won't find there was a separate referendum bill passed to allow this kind of merger and this kind of voting to take place. But the Referendum Act has subsequently been taken away from the entire collection of Acts of Parliament of Singapore because the government would have been ashamed that such a nasty piece of legislation was ever passed. Now, I don't have to repeat to you the detention of political dissidents, nor the defamation suits that were brought against people who disagreed with LKY and the PAP. But what is more telling is the other means adopted by LKY in neutralizing any opposition to his policies. He would send the ISD to raid people's homes. And one of the homes raided was that of a very respectable, noteworthy doctor called Dr. G Rahman. Somehow G Rahman had approached him and tried to persuade him to join the Workers' Party as he was the president then. Now, G Rahman had a sort of neutral approach. He didn't support the PAP. If you don't support the PAP, then like John Foster Dulles said, if you are a friend of my enemy, then you are my enemy. During the Cold War era, that is. So suddenly, G Rahman became an enemy of Lee Kuan Yew. He raided the house. So you use this kind of tactics, it will intimidate people. Not only that, income tax letters will come to any man standing against the PAP asking the taxpayer to file returns for X number of years. We need this information. So you see, you are discomforted. You are stressed out. That's a tactic. I remember two students, architecture students that like Tan Wah Piow was, his own contemporaries, one Chung Ming Ke and one Chan Kam Shi, who were occupying, renting a room, renting a flat owned by a man called Tay Keng Soon, a famous architect in Singapore. What Tay Keng Soon did, his sin was, he challenged the government's HDB policy. And he said, look, you're wasting unnecessary money. In sociological terms, these housing board blocks are not conducive to interaction between people who reside in these blocks. You know what they did? They sent inspectors from the Central Narcotics Bureau to raid his apartment. And these two persons, Chan Kam Shi and Chung Ming Ke, they were architecture students who subsequently graduated in architecture, unlike Wah Piow, because he was completely blocked from finishing his fourth year exam. They stood firm. They asked the inspector who knocked at the door, have you got your warrant to search? He said, I don't need a search warrant. If you suspect a crime has been committed, we are entitled to go in. Of course, after a while, they could have resisted. They didn't want to use physical force, because then there'll be an additional charge, obstructing a public servant in the execution of his duties. That's from the penal code, you know. That's what it says. So they found nothing there incriminating, but it was an intimidatory tactic. The message was sent to Tay Keng Soon, you don't try to be funny. This is what we will do. Citizenships of people who supported the opposition or who you ever stood up against the PAP were deprived. One famous man, multimillionaire Tan Lak Sai, his citizenship got revoked. Why? Because he was sympathetic to Barisan Socialists. This man was a founder, one of the founders of Nanta, Nanyang University. That's the extent to which they go. All right. So I'll wind up. Sorry. I didn't imagine I would take that long. You know? Forgive me. There is now a movement to tap Singaporeans' ideas, and they have something called the Singapore Conversation, the national conversation, inviting members of the public to contribute their views on how to improve the political situation, how there can be interaction between the opposition and the PAP. But at least it's a move, thanks to the people who have been surfing the internet and those who have been sending messages. There is a new dawn in Singapore, I will say, and it's happening in Malaysia as well. So I just want to finish this little piece from me with a line from Wordsworth. You know, now is the time for change, as Dr. Kwa said. There will be change. There will be change in Singapore. So Wordsworth wrote when French Revolution took place in 1789. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. So I leave it to you all young people. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rahman. May I now call upon Wah Piow to actually give his 15 minutes, not 20 minutes.
Thank you, Maria. And thank you very much for coming, especially I think there are a number from Singapore unknown to me before, and how one of them got to know about this talk today was having received an email from the brother or relative from Canada who heard about my interview here, and then when he got the news, he flew over this morning. And I believe there are a few others who came all the way. Now, this may be a pointer for Malaysian Tourism Board, because we refer to the word to come here to refresh and rejuvenate. And in fact, the number of times when Singaporeans have to come here to attend even memorials, which otherwise is rather difficult to organize. And even the book launch in Singapore itself was not without problems. So there it goes, Malaysian Tourism Board, not forgetting this potential area. And don't forget also, there are always some occasionally who looks across the causeway and say whether 3/4 of a mile is too difficult to swim. Those are your potential tourists. Now, Maria mentioned earlier when she was introducing me as a speaker, I'm the speaker on the left. Then she hesitated. She said, not sure whether Wah Piow these days is right or left. Now, those who was here earlier and who's heard what Tan Yew spoke about what I did during the period when I was hiding, because there was nothing much to do, and as an introvert, I could just peep through the curtains and watch the birds pecking at the papaya. And in fact, I learned something profound. I have not seen a left-winged bird. It always goes with 2 wings. And in Singapore, there's only a bloody right-winged eagle. And it's the time to flap sometimes our left wing. And that's how, anyway, I ended up having this idea that, yeah, maybe a bit of a left or a bit of a right at one time or other may be useful. Now, 36 years ago, the last speech I made in Singapore was when I was released from prison and went immediately to the balcony of the Student Union House. And the theme of my speech at that time was to speak out against the culture of silence. And at the time, our main concern that was our only, if one may use the word, a political program or agenda, was the agenda to encourage people to speak out. But fortunately, after 36 years, this message becomes less relevant. Though it is still relevant, but it becomes less relevant because the people has spoken. And the people has spoken thanks to the internet and also thanks to the long process of nation building. And the occasion when the people spoke out was at the last general election when Lee Kuan Yew made his famously infamous speech when he warned and threatened the constituents of Arjunit that if they had the audacity to vote in the opposition in that constituency, they would have to live and repent for the next 4 to 5 years. And it was the word repent that brought about great problem for the PAP, so much so that his son Lee Hsien Loong has to come out to apologize. The mentor is the mentor, he is the prime minister, they are different. That is the distance that Singapore has moved in the last 36 years from the fear of the one man to the daringness, the audacity to think differently. But the old system of control still remains. The old system of control still remains because the PAP has no other program to manage the political system differently than to run on the platform of a one-party state. That the hegemony of the PAP is still paramount. And why is it necessary to have the hegemony of the PAP? Because their candidates, their members of parliament, their ministers would not be able to withstand any intellectual or political challenge from the opposition. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the key weaknesses of the ruling party. Now, having said that the issue of political control it's muted over the years, and especially in the last 10 years by the presence of the internet and cyberspace, that does not necessarily means that the government would respond intelligently. And the most recent example is the way they handle James Minchin, Reverend James Minchin, who was barred from entering Singapore. He's from Melbourne, and all he did was to accept an interview with the Singapore Democratic Party, the SDP. Why did the government need to be threatened, to feel threatened by an interview which probably not many people have watched on television? That it's in fact irrational, but it's an indication of the fear of information. Where do we go from here? The subject of this panel discussion is Prelude to the post-Lee Kuan Yew era. And one thing is certain, is that the authoritarianism, the character of the manner the country is run, not just by one party, but by one man, has passed its sell-by date in this digital era. But the PAP is still stuck in its medieval past. And we only have to ask people. We don't even have to discuss and to get details of how political opposition are controlled. All we need is even to ask a playwright like Wong Sok Yi, whose experiences in the hands of the ISD, whose writing of a play about Filipino maids could lead her eventually to be detained without trial as part of the so-called Marxist conspirators during the infamous Operation Spectrum. Why should a play to be put up in Singapore has to be approved? Why must the script be sent to the ISD? Why must you provide the names of all your actors? And what happens if one of them is sick and you need to put up the play to replace it with someone else? Why must articles be written by political parties to be subjected to stringent control of the state? Those are the issues which is increasingly and obviously indefensible. To understand where do we go from here, to understand whether the Singapore model of stringent control to bring about economic wealth can remain the template for the next 50 years in the post-Lee Kuan Yew era, we first have to objectively understand where the political consensus of Singapore lies in the first 50 years. And I will be the first to admit that that political template where we have authoritarian control, be it under one man or under one party, in order to achieve the economic success, did enjoy a strong political consensus, at least during the period, and we have to be objective, whichever way we look at Singapore politics, and is that model of political control to many appears to have provided the precondition which brought about the economic success. That is one view and a popular view of looking at Singapore. I don't want to engage in the what if debate about if it was more liberal, would it be possible to achieve the present level of progress? But even if we pause at the moment and look at how Singapore achieved its present high economic growth, I believe it is one based on, no doubt, a progressive housing policy at the time where they managed to put 86% of the population in affordable housing. It was a progressive education system. We can be critical about the way students were put through the pressure cooker, but did produce the results. There was an industrialization policy, and no doubt, and more importantly, it was a determined effort to weed out corruption. No doubt, of course, today we have sex scandal and corruption in Singapore among the high flyers, and if you are bored, then just read the Straits Times, especially of the last few weeks, and there are lots of interesting court cases going on. Notwithstanding this, we have to accept that those are the policies. And if we pause a moment and think, okay, you have a good housing policy, you have a good industrialization policy, you have a good education policy, plus a good program to weed out corruption. With these four policies, do you necessarily need an authoritarian system of control? That fifth factor may be debatable. People like us will say, no, we don't need that. The regime will continue to say, yes, they will argue and say that we need that. Fine. That is the first 50 years. But in the post-Lee Kuan Yew era, Singapore has moved on. And we must not forget that as far as the electorate is concerned, those who voted in the PAP over the years, in the last 50 years, they could see their housing has improved from slums to high rise. They have seen themselves progress from being unemployed to being employed. Their own position from being illiterate or with little education, they are able to bring their children to university level, enjoy tertiary level education. So in the last 50 years, with different level of enthusiasm, the PAP enjoyed those votes in their favor. They have now achieved that very high level of economic growth. And there is a time now for a pause. And I believe that was what went on at the last election. And I believe this is the new scenario that faces the Singapore electorate. Now that we have achieved this very high level of economic development, who would still feel the need for high level of political control? The older generation, there may still be 30% of the electorate at least who are die-hard supporters of this line, who will continue to vote for the PAP, and they will vote for it either out of respect or out of the fact that they were able to produce the goods. Then there are those who would start thinking that now that we have achieved this high level of economic growth, what happened to the fruits of our labor? What they see is the contrast between high wages, super wages, the great rewards which was meant to be not just affordable, but morally defensible to get ministers or the prime ministers being the highest paid anywhere in the world. You have this tension between increasing expectations of having a bigger share in the rewards that is brought about by the success and the disappointment. You have the younger generation, the new graduates who come onto the housing, who has to come onto the housing market and feel that they are no longer having that level of satisfaction from the system as their parents enjoyed in the last 50 years. And this mismatch between expectations and what the regime is able to produce is a source of tension. And it is, ladies and gentlemen, because of this source of tension that increasingly there is a call for liberalization. The point is, if the PAP in the first 50 years could address successfully, no doubt, the issue of economic development, are they able for the next 50 years to address the issue of distribution? The issue of distribution were the issues raised by the left in the past. The left was subjected to all forms of repression and so on. We don't have to go through that. But for the next 50 years from now onwards, the issue of distribution are not issues that are raised by the left. The point is that this is an issue which is a grassroots issue and also compounded by the reality that they are feeling the pressure, the tension, and the challenges, the competition from foreigners. As Singapore becomes a global society, it also necessarily becomes a more expensive society. The tension between pensioners who had sacrificed in the last 50 years and now feels marginalized. At the last election, one of the issues which Teo Solang, who stood as a potential member of parliament, raised was the issue of why should we, after 50 years, have to see old ladies in their 70s, 80s, cleaning tables in hawker center. These are manifestations of failure somewhere within the economic system. And my view is that ideologically, the PAP are either unable or unwilling to address. Whether they are able or unable to address the issue is a different matter from the issue of political control. As far as the PAP response to all these challenges, especially after the last election, is to say, yes, from now onwards, we know our weaknesses, we will be responsive. But can one accept being responsive to popular demands for changes here and there be a replacement for democracy that people want to see? Why people want to see democracy is a very simple thing. The cyberspace, their experience with personal choices through pressing of the button makes them feel empowered in all other areas except politics in Singapore. And I think this is where is something which the PAP will not be able to deliver. Why would they not be able to deliver? Because they have to cling on to the ideology of their own party's hegemony. In the same way as in China, the Communist Party will also face that big problem so long as you feel that you have to maintain that hegemony of power. And this is where any form of political debate, any form of political discourse in Singapore, unless one look at the necessity of a thorough reform and which area is necessary for any thorough reform, I believe it has to go back to the protection of human rights. And that can only be done by revisiting the Constitution. There are professors here, Andrew Harding, who is a professor on the Constitution, and whatever I say is subject to his agreement or disagreement, but Dr. G Rahman has done a brilliant study on the Singapore Constitution. In fact, a lot of the things that I say, I just plagiarized from his excellent thesis. So don't ever think of me as an original thinker. But the point is that he mentioned at the time he wrote it a few years ago, is that was 37 years after the independence of Singapore, where he mentioned that there were as many incidents of amendments to the Constitution as it was in a number of years. And each of the amendments to the Constitution is always towards removal, tinkering with the rights of the individual. The Constitution, which should be the basis of any form of political consensus, the Constitution, which should be the soul of the nation, is never taken lightly by those in power in Singapore. And I believe that for the next 50 years, the basis of any change has to be towards creating a political environment where there can be a period where the Constitution can be looked at, can be revised and be strengthened. But that, I believe, cannot be achieved without getting rid of the PAP. But the notion, the thought of getting rid of the PAP at this stage, to many, may even be unthinkable. Can you imagine back in those days in United States, where the black can feel that we like to have the rights as a white man? It must be unthinkable at that time for many blacks until they were liberated. In the same time as during the time of slavery, can a slave ever contemplate to be a free man? And in the same way as in Singapore, the population is so depoliticized that probably if 36 years ago, if I were in Singapore, and if I ever even express this notion that, hey, look, can we start contemplating of Singapore without PAP? Straight away, I'll be condemned even by my own colleagues. It's unthinkable. But now I believe it is something more thinkable and doable. And what is so difficult about achieving that? Singapore is a homogeneous society. Singapore has a very intelligent electorate. Singapore has no doubt a civil service that is very much controlled by the PAP and the PAP apparatus, but underlying that, it has very decent people who are running the civil service. The question of forming a new government, which for people appears to be unthinkable, is doable. And why is it doable? Why do I have that confidence? It's because after the last general elections, we see that there are more individuals of professional caliber, people of caliber and integrity coming forward to provide their intellectual input to the opposition party. And this is where the notion that the opposition can only play the role as a watchdog. What is the point? You even think of yourself as a watchdog if you don't have the teeth and you dare not bark. But besides that, if you want to be a watchdog, be an NGO. And I believe that there is this stronger notion that it is desirable and it is possible to look at Singapore as a democratic state. For the younger ones, all they need is to look at United States, to look at Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. Why do I mention Japan, Korea, and Taiwan? Because these are the three countries that undermines this notion that democracy is incompatible with Asian values. And Korea and Taiwan in particular are the two countries that shows that it is possible, even for a country which not too long ago had repressive military government. It was possible for a condition to arise where the opposition could come into power, not just coming into power. When they came into power, they strengthened the economic institution to the extent that they were voted out over time. So they passed that two-term test. And I believe that those are examples to undermine that notion that democracy and Asian values are incompatible. And Madam Chairman, the last point that I wish to raise, since you have given me only 5 minutes, that was 3 minutes ago, is that the political template of the last 50 years, whichever way we look at it, becomes irrelevant. For the next 50 years, there is a need to start a new template. And that new template has to be based on the Constitution. My argument is that to achieve that, we cannot rely on the PAP for being responsive, because democracy is not a question of just the right to interact with the incumbent, the ruling party. The democracy is essentially the right to vote them out. And if we keep repeating this, that it is not just doable, it is desirable, and it is something that we start contemplating, I think there will come a time when there will be less tourists having to launch their books in Kuala Lumpur, which is a global city, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Wah Piow.